Welcome, everyone. My name is Professor Stephanie Malia Hom. I am an assistant professor of transnational Italian studies in the Department of French and Italian. And I'd like to thank you all for being here this evening, and I hope you enjoyed Death in Venice on the big screen. I'd like to welcome our guest, Professor Joan Roman Resina from Stanford University, who has just published a book, Luchino Visconti, filmmaker and philosopher, with Bloomsbury in 2022. And to begin, Professor Resina, could you tell us, set the context for us of how, where does this film fit in with Luchino Visconti's oeuvre, and tell us a little bit about him as a director.
Well, first of all, let me begin by thanking the Carsey-Wolf Center for their kind invitation, as well as the Department of Italian Studies and my colleague, Professor Hom. It's a real pleasure to be here, and it's a double pleasure to be here on the occasion of the projection of Death in Venice, which is one of my favorite, if not the favorite movie, in a long career of cinema experiences. The context of Visconti cinema, I'll try to be very brief because I know that there will be other issues that we want to discuss. But Visconti is usually credited with having launched the style named neorealism in Italy with a film titled Ossessione in 1943. You may be familiar with this term, neorealism. Or at least another important representative is Roberto Rossellini, the famous film Roma Città Aperta from 1945, so end of World War II. And then other names like Vittorio De Sica, a lot of people know The Bicycle Thief, and a bunch of other directors from this period that turn their attention to actuality, to things as they look, and particularly with a keen observation of the working classes. Visconti produced yet another very famous film in this style, La Terra Trema, which is based on a 19th century novel, a realistic novel. The Italian title is In Malavoglia by an author named Verga. And what he does is quite interesting. What he does is he goes to Sicily and films the story in a fisherman's village without a cast of real actors. So he gets all these people from the village who are poor people, poor fishermen, to act, and he asks them to act spontaneously as they usually are in life. So it's an interesting combination of a film which has a story that pre-exists the filming, and yet the actors are not acting out the story, but basically representing their own lives, representing themselves. And to add realistic value to this portrayal of that society, they don't speak Italian. They speak in their Sicilian language, which is, or was, I suppose, nearly incomprehensible to Italians from the mainland. So that is one of the primordial, one of the most interesting experimentations in neorealism. But after that film, Visconti turns to a different type of filmmaking and gradually becomes engaged in, I would say, still continues to work on a sort of a realistic platform, realistic basis, but turning his attention away from these working classes to the aristocracy. And at this moment, some of the critics begin to say, well, he has betrayed the social commitment and so on and so forth. And because of the lavish style of his recreation of these aristocratic environments, as you have seen in the Hôtel de Verre in Death in Venice, he's considered to be a decadent filmmaker. That is an adjective, a qualifier that sticks to him and that certainly bothered him. But at some point, he became almost cynical about it. Once a critic alluded to this by saying, well, talked about him as being an aestheticist, and he said, he cut him short, and he said, well, go ahead and say it, and in decadent, that's what you mean. But, and then he uses the word decadence and says, but decadence is not what you mean by it. It's not a moral judgment, but it's rather an artistic style. And then he uses as a term of reference for his decadent style no one less than Thomas Mann, the author of the short story, the novella Death in Venice. And he says, if that's your point of reference, it's fine with me. And the other interesting thing to say about the context of his cinema is that in the 60s and early 70s, when there's a whole new type of cinema coming out of Europe, art house cinema, of course, namely the Nouvelle Vague, represented by somebody like Jean-Luc Godard, Visconti is not interested. He doesn't follow the trend and continues to produce this sort of realistic recreations of aristocratic societies or high bourgeois societies undauntedly. And so critics of the time, critics oftentimes follow the trends and the fashions, at some point consider him to be more or less obsolete, artistically or stylistically obsolete. But I think that as time goes by, his cinema is certainly vindicated and is certainly much more watchable than some of those experiments that were taking place in the 60s and 70s.
Thank you for that. I'm interested, as you write in your book, this idea of decadence was sort of an organizing principle, particularly of Visconti's later films and the German trilogy that you analyze in the book. Could you tell us more about this idea of decadence and Visconti's interpretation to it in relation to cinema, as well as his own personal history?
Okay, that's a lot of. Especially beginning with the film Senso, which is a film from the 1950s, 1959, I think. I'm probably wrong by 1 or 2 years. This is a turning point in his filmography. He already shows us, he places the story in Venice, so there's a kind of prelude to his later film. Immediately the film begins with an unforgettable scene in the Opera House of Venice, in La Fenice, during the presentation, of the performance, rather, of a Verdi opera, Il Trovatore. And that film already marks this turnaround towards these fancy environments, locating the problems, the drama that takes place within the aristocratic class well inside or in the middle of an interesting or an important or decisive historical period for Italian history, namely the Risorgimento and the fights, the struggles for Italian unification. In historical terms, the centerpiece or the original intention was to foreground an important battle that was a defeat, a severe defeat for the Italian army, namely the Battle of Custoza. And I think that is the moment when he turns his lens inward to this the historical roots of the present moment, of his present, and links as he sees it, the decadence of traditional middle class or upper class European values, namely humanistic values, the deterioration of those values, links them to the decay of his own class. He was by birth an aristocrat, coming from an extremely highly positioned family. The Viscontis, one of his ancestors had been a condottiero, one of these strongmen that ruled ruthlessly in the city of Milan. And in fact, that ancestor had basically funded the construction or part of the construction of the cathedral in Milan, a very important piece of architecture. So his family was really, very, very ingrained in the highest level of Italian society. Luchino himself, the director, used to be sort of a playmate. He was friends with the king of Italy, Vittorio Emanuele III, the one who lost the monarchy to fascism. So we're talking about a very high level, and somebody who at some point, and I think because of historical events, realized that his class basically was doomed. He was one of the last representatives of that aristocracy and the recipient of that extremely select education that allowed him to then go out in several directions. And cinema is the one that he's mostly remembered for, but he was also a very keen and intelligent opera producer. He produced a number of operas in La Scala, and something that is not so well known, he was also the discoverer of artistic talent. He was a great promoter and supporter of no less than Maria Callas, the famed opera singer. A tyrannical director in many ways. He made his actors and actresses suffer because he tried to extract always the best that they could do. And in the case of Callas, well, he made her lose a lot of weight because he told her, look, you cannot represent La Traviata with all of those extra pounds. So, he put her through a severe diet, and she actually became the slim, elegant figure that everybody knows her for. He was a perfectionist. He was somebody who would simply not cut any corners. He would not concede anything in terms of the needs for an extravagant, if you will, form of realism that went so far as to, for instance, in The Damned and in La Caduta degli Dei, the first film in the trilogy, the German trilogy, to have first-class wine to be drunk by the actors because it represented a class, a family that was at the top of the German society, namely basically it's the Krupp family. So the famous or infamous makers of weapons that served the Second Reich during World War II. So this extraordinarily rich family could not be represented by actors sipping cheap wine. It had to be really good wine. Or he installed wooden floors, wooden parquet, throughout the mansion where the film was filmed because he wanted the microphones to pick up the steps of the boots of the Nazis, of the Gestapo and the SS when they come into the mansion. So the microphone had to take up that resonance, and so he spent the money on this. He insisted on having real linen, high-quality linen inside the drawers, although they were never opened during the film. But they had to be there to be convincing. So you can begin to sense, the particular attention to detail that this director managed to produce. And so I have extended myself so much that I think that I'll stop here because otherwise we won't get to other parts of the conversation.
Yeah. So that's a very interesting point you bring up about Luchino Visconti being a perfectionist and how every shot and every detail in the film is completely premeditated.
Yeah.
And so turning our attention now to the film Death in Venice, the first time I saw that film, I was very surprised to see that you hardly saw anything of Venice itself, and the film took place in the Hotel de Bain. And I was wondering if you could speak about the decision, Visconti's decision to orient the film almost entirely within this restricted space.
Yes. There's a precedent, again, the film that I mentioned earlier, Senso, which begins inside the opera house in La Fenice, gives us already this internal look at the lavishness of aristocratic society in Venice, but then also largely avoids the typical and overused images of the city. In Death in Venice, we see some glimpses, right? I mean, at the very beginning, we see as the steamboat approaches the city, we see Venice in the background. We see the island of San Giorgio Maggiore, and we catch sight of the Giudecca. And later, of course, there's that scene where we see the inside of Piazza San Marco, kind of interrupted by the columnate, as he walks to the travel agency to exchange money. But otherwise, it's very sparing. All right, Visconti does not allow the camera to remain focused intently on the architectural beauties of the city, but rather gives us, in exchange, extremely long shots of the inside of the Hotel des Bains. So the question is, why does he do this? Right? I mean, the choice of the hotel is more or less already given or pre-given by the fact that that was the very hotel where Thomas Mann and his wife Katia Mann and Thomas' brother Heinrich, another famous German writer, spent about a week in late May, early June of 1911, and that, from that visit, Thomas got the inspiration because he had sort of a similar experience in seeing this very beautiful Polish youth that he got fascinated with, and then recreates some of that experience in his novella. So the Hôtel des Bains was already more or less mandated by the recreation of the story, the adaptation of the story, but also there may also be a little bit of an autobiographical aspect because Luchino's family, when they stayed in Venice, when he was a child, they stayed in this very hotel. So there is also the possibility of this retrospective look. What I find interesting is that instead of doing the easy thing, selling you as viewers the already well-known picture beauty of Venice, he entertains the camera. He spends a lot of time showing us those people, the guests at the hotel. Right? So he gives us an intense look of the kind of society that would have been the guests, the international guests, at this very fancy hotel. Fancy back then, it was built around 1900, fancy at the beginning of the 20th century, and the kind of environment that it represented as a prelude, right, to the decomposition of that very society that will take place later, in fact, retroactively in The Damned, although The Damned was filmed before Death in Venice. The trilogy is somehow upside down. We have the most recent period, namely the period of Nazism in Germany, 1930s. In the middle, we have Death in Venice, so placed around 1911. And then the third film of the trilogy, Ludwig, goes back to the 1880s. So it's like going backward in a process of excavation through images of the root causes of European decadence. Okay? And what is obviously very interesting is that in doing this, he's doing a historical analysis of basically a continental process at the same time as he's studying the evolution, the decadent evolution of his own class and his own family. Right?
Oh, that's great. So viewing Death in Venice within this trilogy of films is very important. And as you said, he adapted it from the Thomas Mann novel. So we have Visconti, we have Thomas Mann, and there's the presence of a third artist in the film, which is Gustav Mahler. And I was wondering if you could speak to how Visconti's film, Death in Venice, engages literature, music, and cinema to deliver its own message about art.
Yes. So Thomas Mann writes a novel about this man, Gustav Aschenbach, who in the novella is not a musician but a writer. A writer that has received awards from the government, from the state, because he's written, in essence, within the framework of the interest of society in Germany in the early 20th century. So somehow he represents somebody who is a model for the state, somebody who as an intellectual supports the idea of the state. And Thomas Mann presents him as someone who is extraordinarily, almost puritanical in his dedication, his devotion to work. And in a sense, we see this transplanted or adapted in the movie, although of course we have to guess a lot of it because instead of having a third person, a narrator, telling us all of this background, we have to somehow extract it from the combination of sound, music, gesture, and images. Now, Thomas Mann said that during his brief stay, which, as in the movie, we see Aschenbach, von Aschenbach at the beginning of the movie on this steamboat, coming actually. We know that he's from Munich because when he says that he wants to go back, right, he wants to he takes the train ticket to go back to Munich. So he's not coming from Munich by steamboat. He's coming from elsewhere. Actually, he's coming from Istria, that is the coast in Croatia. He's coming from a harbor named Pola, and that was exactly the itinerary that the Manns did. They intended to spend their vacation on the Adriatic coast, and they were in Istria, and then they didn't like it there and decided that that was the wrong destination. They took a boat in Pola and then transferred themselves to Venice and to the Lido. In this period, in this brief period, Thomas Mann says that he followed anxiously the news in the papers about the deteriorating health and eventually the death of Gustav Mahler, the musician. So Mahler is somehow already behind his fascination with these experiences that he himself had in the Lido, in the Hotel des Bains, and it gets merged. Only, of course, for a writer, writing about a musician is not impossible. He did it, and he did a great job at it in Dr. Faustus, a long novel that he published at the very end of World War II. But in this short novella, it would have been very, very hard to transmit everything that he transmits about the psychology and the transformation of this writer if it had been literally a musician. So he changes the profession, and what Visconti does is he restores the personality of Aschenbach to that of Gustav Mahler, that of a musician. And I think it was really a stroke of genius to do so, because it would have been rather awkward. We see a little bit of that, right, in at these moments when there's a kind of a voicing off, but we know it's the voice in Aschenbach's brain. When he hears the voice of Alfred, his friend, who's always debating with him and accusing him of writing the wrong kind of music, right? But these moments, if they had been more often, if they had been more frequent, would have made a very awkward film. Instead of that, what Visconti does, and does magnificently, is to pair the music, which is not extra diegetic. It's not background music, but it's music that's conveying constantly the emotions that take place within the psyche of Aschenbach, and putting them in a dialectical relation with the fantastic performance of Dick Bogart, right? The gestures, the facial expressions, that little by little convey to us not only his anxiety from the very beginning, right? I mean, we see him that something's troubling him when he's sitting on the deck of the ship, but as that anxiety intensifies, we detect the inner struggle that Mann in the novella can tell us in words, but that we have to somehow deduct from what we see and what we hear in the movie.
Yeah, and speaking of struggle, in your book you write that the critiques about Death in Venice that focus on the protagonist's pederastic urges for the young boy Tazio entirely miss the point of the film, really. And it's actually about the symbolic pursuit of an artist in search of beauty. Could you expand on that point?
Yeah, yes. I mean, there's many cues for that, but one that's hard to miss is that we are not presented with a homosexual character. You know, we're shown that he was a family man. He had a wife, daughter. He seemed to love both of them. There's no thought of him going to Venice in search of some kind of gay relationship. None of that is there. Something happens. Something simply appears in front of him. He's been concerned about beauty. And we know that from already the conversations that he has with his friend Alfred, friend or non-friend, I mean friend or enemy, we can talk about that. But the conversations that he has with Alfred turn around perfection, beauty. And the question, the debate between the two of them is that Alfred keeps telling him, nonsense, none of this, you cannot achieve perfection by effort, which was, it was the belief of Aschenbach, that if you're ascetic, if you just devote yourself to hard work, if you pursue beauty with a tremendous renunciation of everything else, then you have a chance that perhaps you can accomplish this, this whatever it is that we call beauty, this sense of perfection in the object. And Alfred's point is, nonsense. You're absolutely wrong. All that you get is cold, a coldness of form that gets obviously rejected by your audience. Beauty is something you cannot create on demand. Beauty happens. Beauty is there spontaneously. It assaults you. And what we see at the first sight of Tadzio, when Tadzio is, and the camera does an interesting shift from each one of the family members. We see the girls, their relative beauties, but then finally the striking image of Tadzio. And we are watching along with him. We follow his gaze. That's his gaze going from one to the other of the members of the family. And finally, Tadzio. And that's beauty that assaults him. And beauty happens to be incarnated in a young boy. For him, that is a surprise. He has not expected that. But he becomes defenseless. And he becomes defenseless because from the beginning, he's someone who's devoted to the pursuit of beauty. There's a point, and it is very much stressed in the novella, where there's a discussion of Phaedrus, namely the dialogue by Plato, which is the dialogue precisely about the nature of beauty, right? And it's the dialogue between Socrates and this young boy, this adolescent Phaedrus, who is in love with this ugly old man, namely Socrates, because Socrates, who was famously ugly, apparently attracted young Thebes through the beauty of his soul, so the beauty of the intellect. And there's a whole theory of love that's presented in Phaedrus. I mean, all of those of you who have read Plato, you know that love really has one dialogue named the Symposium, where various characters discuss, what is love. But in Phaedrus, love is presented as under the patronage of the god Eros. So Eros is a helper of the soul that wants to attain wisdom. Eros is what draws one into the pursuit of beauty, and then there's a scale of ascension, an ascending scale, whereby the soul, the intellect, is first of all attracted to beauty through the senses, but little by little climbs from the concrete to the abstract, to the general, and ultimately the wise soul is capable of visualizing, of looking at beauty as an idea. And so my contention is that what Aschenbach really is after is that idea of the beautiful. But that idea of the beautiful, as Alfred keeps telling him, is not going to be created by your effort, by the force of your will, but it's going to be something that requires the presence of the intervention of the senses, and that will only be there even against your will, so despite of your will. We can, if you want me to continue, along these lines, I would then say something about this relationship between the two friends. But maybe you want to turn to something different.
Let's come back to that. I wanted to go a little deeper into these classical references and the sort of what you've been speaking about are key themes in philosophy: truth, art, beauty, the pursuit of beauty, the pursuit of an illusion. And in the Thomas Mann novella, it's replete with classical references. And upon watching the Visconti film again, we saw these references visually. Yes. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what point is particularly, you mentioned Phaedrus, but there's Hermes that you mentioned in your book, and what purpose do these references serve?
Right. So Hermes is, by the way, is a divinity that is not mentioned in the novella, right? I mean, I came to the conclusion that we really have Hermes at play here, and I can explain why I think so. But in the novella we have, the obvious philosophical background, besides Plato, besides the allusion to Phaedrus, is Nietzsche, right? Nietzsche, and in particular his first book, as a young assistant professor, which was a theory. Philology said that it was completely off the track, but it has been extremely influential. The book titled "The Birth of the Tragedy," or "The Birth of Tragedy," where Nietzsche presents all of essential Greek culture, but particularly through the tragic, through tragedians, as a contest, a tension between two divinities, namely Apollo, which he says is the god of form, and the solar god, right? The god that would gives us the stable forms in visual forms, and then the opposite divinity, Dionysus, who is the god of frenzy, the god of the tears down form, the god of impulse, the god of energy that cannot be dominated by the will. Right? So this opposition is not only a reference to the classical world, where the statuary or the sculptural forms that we see Tadzio adopting in the film clearly respond, right, to this predominance of form or this desire of form on the part of the viewer, on the part of Aschenbach, but also eventually we see the other side, the dark side of this relation, which is represented theoretically, in the theoretical positions, the theoretical statements of Alfred, of the friend. Alfred is not really a character in the novella. Alfred is a recourse of Visconti, who serves precisely to represent in more or less, in diegetic and more or less realistic form, this tension between these two polar opposites, these Nietzschean opposites, where Aschenbach would be the Apollonian in that dichotomy, the one who insists upon the stability of form, the one who insists on the predominance of will, and then Alfred who says, no, it's the senses and it's something you cannot control. Right? Alfred, by the way, is not only sort of a voice for the Dionysian, but is also what I would call a Mephistophelian character. He's a demonic character. Right? He is a character that constantly tries to draw Aschenbach to the recognition of the abyss. Right? That which is the source of chaos, that which ultimately destroys and eliminates the individual aspect of the soul. And in his letters, in his correspondence, particularly with an analyst of myth, Carl Kerenyi, who was a disciple of Freud, Kerenyi wrote a book on Hermes, and Thomas Mann recognizes, acknowledges that at a certain point he became more and more interested in mythology and religion, particularly later on, but clearly he was already in this track when he wrote Death in Venice. And they discuss the presence of a dark Apollo. So not the Apollo that Nietzsche talks about, as being the sun god, but an Apollo that without ceasing to be Apollo also represented the dark aspects of existence. And it's interesting that in the film we see, there's a couple of moments, right, that the camera shows us this blurry sun arising in the horizon. First, when the steamboat is arriving in Venice, that is already a sort of premonition of the direction that he has taken, that Aschenbach has taken towards death. And then little by little, as he has more experiences of what we call mystagogic experiences, of being led, being directed in this direction of a sort of revelation of beauty, but a revelation that nonetheless is going to be lethal to him. We see time and again new moments in which we get these cues. And one of them, interestingly enough, is, you've just seen it, when after stalking Tadzio throughout the streets of Venice, late at night or very early in the morning, he opens up the window of his room, looks out into the sea, precisely at the moment when the sun just begins to faintly illuminate the horizon. Apollo, or the dark Apollo, it's that combination of darkness, it's still dark, and yet there's that light coming up. And the very last scene, when he dies, if you recall, the sky in the background of Tadzio has again that same ambiguous color, that sort of rosy, brownish, not clearly illuminated horizon. But at this point, Tadzio has adopted a totally sculptural position, with his arm lifted and pointing upwards, and his arm, the other arm akimbo on his hip, reproducing a moment that we have seen a bit earlier when Tadzio, leading Aschenbach on throughout the labyrinth of little alleys in Venice, also stops for a moment and puts his arm precisely in that position and gazing at him to make sure that Aschenbach is following. This is Hermes. Hermes, if you look at some of his the statues that represent this Greek god, has precisely his arm akimbo in this very position. Now, what is happening in this sort of moments when Aschenbach is being literally led on by young Tadzio throughout this labyrinth of streets? This is not the typical image of Venice, right? These are the guts of the city. And we see garbage, we see shady characters that approach Aschenbach as he tries to pass by them. We see fires and smoke. This is literally the underworld. Tadzio, Hermes, is the guide of the souls into the underworld, so he is leading him on. And until the final collapse, he points to the realm of the ideas. So this is, for me, a fairly obvious understanding of the film. It's also fairly obvious in the novella, but unfortunately it is missed by those critics that only see an old pederast following this youth. It's important to remark also in this connection that at no moment, except at the moment of his imagination, when he imagines that his moral call is to break the news to the Polish family that that there's cholera and you better get the hell out of here, he thinks for a moment about doing that. That's the honorable thing to do, but he doesn't do it. At that moment, in his imagination, he's rewarded by the mother turning her gaze away, and letting him put his hand on his idol's head. That's the whole extent of his corporal perversion. I mean, he never imagines a sexual situation. The most that he imagines in his wishful thinking is putting his hand paternally protectively on his idol. He wants to preserve him alive because it's beauty on this earth. And yet, he doesn't do it. That's the moment of moral collapse. He takes into stride the fact that his idol may die, that it is mortal beauty, and that beauty has to be mortal, as his friend Alfred has been saying all along.
And I have one more question before we open questions to the audience, and that is about the last scene. So you're talking about Tadzio pointing the way, and it's a moment of transcendence.
Right.
And what struck me about that frame was that we have the unattended camera there, and that's certainly not in Mann's novella. Could you speak to?
No, it is in Mann's novella. It is in Mann's novella, and it's in Mann's with a little difference. In Mann's novella, because we don't have images, it's just language. Mann can create the environment, and he says that the black cloth of the camera is flapping in the air. This we don't see in the movie because the air is still, right? But we see the camera unattended. In Mann's novella, for me, it's impossible not to interpret that wind, that flapping of the cloth, as the soul, the pneuma, right, that expires, that goes out from the body of Aschenbach, and that follows the direction that Tadzio is pointing to, right? But in the film, we don't have that flapping of the black cloth, but nevertheless, we have the unattended camera, which means it's a subjectless camera. There's no longer a subject behind the gaze. We've been following Aschenbach's gaze all along the film. We've been ogling Tadzio through Aschenbach's eyes, his sight. We have shared his scopophilia, if you want to call it that. But at this moment, that's no longer possible because there's no longer a subject behind the gaze.
Thank you.
All right.
But I'd like to just thank Professor Resina for a wonderful Q&A. And to everyone for being here, it's been a pleasure.